Welcome to another episode of Inside Infrastructure, an ongoing series providing an inside look at the decisions and decision makers responsible for Australia's city-shaping infrastructure initiatives. The series is co-hosted by Adrian and Ilya, CEO of Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, and me, Ilya Zak, from series sponsor PwC Australia. Adrian, how's it going?
Yeah, I'm well. How are you?
Pretty good. So what have we got on for today?
Well, today we're discussing all things Uber, as we're lucky enough to be joined by the GM of Uber in Australia and New Zealand, Susan Anderson. Ride-sharing has become so pervasive that it's hard to remember what it was like before you could just tap a button and get a ride. Ilya and I spoke to Susan not too long ago about her role at Uber and her take on the evolving role of ride-sharing in the broader transport sector. So here it is, Susan Anderson on Inside Infrastructure. So Susan Anderson, welcome to Inside Infrastructure. Obviously, you're the MD of Uber in Australia, but you've had quite an interesting career background and pathway that's led you to here. Could you maybe talk us through that pathway?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for having me today. Looking forward to the conversation. Well, before I came to Australia, I was working for Amazon in the UK. And actually, this is the second time I have lived in Australia. I'll take you all the way back and tell you about my career history and like my adventures down under, which as a Brit, I think is part of the law that you have to come down under at some point. But I graduated from Oxford, studied economics and management at New College. I then joined a company called Capital One, which is a financial consumer finance company, but was a startup at the point at which I joined it.
Check it. That's like credit cards and car loans.
Absolutely, it was credit cards, and the thing that appealed to me when I joined was it was a company that was trying to disrupt the industry, to provide better customer experience using a data-driven approach. For me as a graduate, that appealed to me, and actually I found that theme has gone through my career. I was at Capital One for a few years and actually travelled to Australia just backpacking, and at that point joined Bain in Melbourne and worked strategy consulting.
I was here.
Yeah, absolutely. My husband was working at that point on the Melbourne Commonwealth Games. So we were in Melbourne for a couple of years, went back to London, still with Bain, and left Bain to go and join Amazon. I was appealed to me to do something new. At that point, I'd had 2 kids, and so I spent time running the baby category, spending time thinking about what is it that new mothers need at that time, and 5 a.m. blackout blinds is one of the things. I went on to launch a product called Prime Now, which is 1-hour retail delivery. And then my husband got a call.
This was in the US?
This was in the UK, in London. And my husband had been doing London Olympics and he'd done the London Rugby World Cup. And he got a call from the Gold Coast Commonwealth Games that said, will you come down under, spend a couple of years at the beach? We thought that sounded like a great idea. So moved over with the whole family, and I joined Uber at that point to launch Uber Eats across Australia and New Zealand.
What do you, so I think you touched on it briefly, but what would you say is the common theme through those various roles?
I always reflect that whilst I've spent quite a lot of time in tech, I'm not a techie.
Right.
In fact, what I look for in roles is an ability to really get in the mind of customers, think about what is the problem or the opportunity that you're trying to solve for them, and then to be creative about how to do that in a way that's empowered by technology, with smarter people than me actually making that happen. So I think that's what appeals to me, and that's what I look for when I'm looking at opportunities.
The Lyft CEO said recently that he still drives once a year to, be on the tools.
Might have been lying, but it is his claim.
Would you do that?
I spend a lot of time in cars with driver partners, and I spend a lot of time in what we call our green light hubs, which is our customer service centres that we have in each of our large capital cities across Australia, talking to driver partners, understanding what is easy and less easy for them in order to tackle that. Right now, I spend less time actually driving the car. More than anything, my car would not get a 5-star rating, so I wouldn't want to put anybody through that.
Speaking of ratings, what's your Uber rating?
4.86. I dropped a bit of a rating. I was at 4.87 up to a couple of weeks ago, but I've been traveling internationally and on my phone a lot doing emails and not necessarily where I should be when I was being picked up.
Can you look up who gave you a 4 or a 3 or a 2 or whatever it is?
I would never do that. I just have to be a better rider.
What do you got, Adrian?
I have 4.79.
It's not bad.
I think I'm up to 4.9.
Mine was really high.
4.9.
Just saying,
You are a
look,
very good person. Yeah.
I'm very
It's hard
talkative.
work.
Yeah, it's a good and a bad.
Which sometimes gets me a low rating.
My rating was really high, and then we were in Indonesia and we had the kids with us, and just it dropped dramatically.
Oh yeah, blame the kids.
Yeah, sticking it on the kids. Yeah.
I think there's different countries use the ratings in a different way. For instance, in Japan, 3-star is great ride, exactly as you thought it should be. To get a 5-star is exceptionally difficult. So it just adjusts what it looks like across the world.
It is interesting though, because it's everyone's got a rating. It's not like a feedback score on eBay or something, which is just about the transaction. It's effectively everyone's got a rating as a human being. And it's their Uber rating.
So you're just saying you're a better person.
I'm 0.04 better than both of you.
Well, fair enough. I guess we just have to accept it, Susan, and move on. I don't really know where to go for it. This is a cul-de-sac. I don't know. He is a better person. I don't know what the...
Let's go to Uber today, because you made your way up from Uber Eats you mentioned, and you made your way up to start as GM of Uber in Australia and New Zealand. Is that right? And that was quite recent. But just recently, when your global CEO was here, he mentioned that if all the jurisdictions were like Australia, he'd be taking a whole lot more vacations. I must have felt pretty good, I guess, when he said that. But what do you think it was that he was referring to?
I mean, it's pretty nice when your CEO is, I believe he also said that the team in Australia is one of the best. And so that's really nice to hear. And I would agree that I think the team that work here, very hard on trying to provide a fantastic customer experience, are second to none.
Full disclosure, Susan is currently looking at a member of her team as she says that, because she's sitting in the room. But I'm sure it would have happened regardless. I'm sure it would have.
Look, I think Australians embrace technology, and we've seen this across both Uber and Uber Eats. I mean, if we think back to when Uber first launched in Australia, but before my time, launched with the black product, but when the peer-to-peer product came along, people just loved the experience, how convenient it was, no more kind of having to, persuade somebody to take you to a destination. You could get a car in a matter of minutes, go to where you wanted it to be. It was affordable, and it's changed how people get around. If you talk to teenagers now or people in their early 20s, I think they wouldn't remember what a pre-Uber time was. I remember it. I remember trying to get home at night when I was a teenager, when I used to go out late. And it was hard. You used to have to plan it in advance, and it really changed the world.
It's the ultimate measure of success these days for a startup is that Uber, well, it's not a startup anymore, but Uber's a verb now.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember my first ever Uber trip was actually in London, and I was with my 2 kids. They're pretty young, and we were trying to get home from a fireworks celebration. There was crowds everywhere, queues for buses, and I was just getting that feeling that parents get, where your children are about to melt down and you need to get them home. My sister-in-law said, let's get an Uber. And I was like, what? I don't know what that is. And she hit a button, and 4 minutes later, there was a Prius there with a very friendly man who took us home, and the kids got in their bath and went to bed. And I remember thinking, this has changed my life. And it did. It changed how I moved around London. And so I think what we found here in Australia is that customers have really embraced Uber. They demand high customer service in this country. And I think Uber has worked hard to do that. And we've also seen a similar thing within the Uber Eats business, which is it's one of the most successful in our global network here in Australia because of the quality of the food, quality of restaurants, as well as the fact that people really embrace this technology. And then factored onto that, there is a lot of demand for people to have this flexible way of earning in Australia. It's something that's extremely popular. We have over 60,000 driver partners on the Uber Rides platform on a regular basis who choose every day whether they're going to use this. And the feedback we get from them is high. Things that we can always improve on. But I think that's what he's referencing is the fact that both the driver partners as well as the riders just thoroughly embrace the product, and it means that we can innovate and try new things here that we can export.
So to what extent do you think that the nature of the incumbent taxi industry was a contributor to the success of Uber in Australia?
I think that customers were excited about having alternatives, in particular being able to get to the destination, no matter whether that's a short trip or a longer trip. I think consistent feedback I hear is that driver partners are really friendly. People have a good experience in them, talking to them and sharing stories. I think that's something that resonates with Australian customers.
Is it the same in all the jurisdictions? Are you equally successful in all the jurisdictions in Australia, or is there one that stands out?
We're present in over 37 towns and cities now in Australia. Actually, part of that is because we've been asked to launch in some of the smaller places. There was a lot of demand for Uber to come, and so we listened to that and responded. We find that we're equally successful across most of the cities. It's just different demographics around when the trips happen. So there's a lot of business trips in Sydney and Melbourne, as you'd expect. Airport trips are quite a lot of the traffic across some of the bigger cities. And then in some of the smaller places, it's much more around trying to get people home so that they don't need to drink or drive or have a designated driver.
Is there an ideal density that Uber is most successful in, or is there a minimum or a maximum? How do you decide which new town to go into?
We're always trying to balance off the rider demand, so how many people want to take the service versus what is the earnings expectations that a driver partner can expect. It is pretty open access to the platform. So if you want to earn, you need to complete a background check. You need to make sure you've got insurance documents and meet the local regulations. We're fully regulated across all of Australia now. But if you meet that, then you are able to access the platform to earn. So we are always trying to balance, is there enough demand in order for that to be a good use of a driver partner's time, and try to educate driver partners about what they might expect.
But statistically, what have you found? Which size of city or jurisdiction works well, or what kind of town is too small for Uber to go into?
Adelaide.
Adelaide. We have a great business in Adelaide. It's genuinely hard for me to pull out any that don't work. I think you see some places such as the Surf Coast. It's very seasonal. In summer, that will be a lot busier than it is during winter time. But at peak, at Christmas time, everywhere's busy because people are using this as a way to avoid drink driving, and so that they can go out and not have to take their cars. So it's just the seasonal patterns that look different based on the type of city or town.
Okay.
At its core, Uber is a dispatch platform, in effect, and
linking drivers to jobs.
And it's a logistics type service, but the only area of logistics that beyond moving people has been Uber Eats. Ilya and I were talking before, we were kind of interested, why not other parts of the freight task?
Yeah. Well, we're still, as a business, pretty new. And so Uber Eats launched in 2016. So that is actually only just a 3-year-old business. And when you think about the scale of growth and how that is now, actually the brand awareness on Uber Eats in Australia is the same as McDonald's, which is extraordinary in that small amount of time.
Convenient that you've got McDonald's on Uber Eats.
I mean, yes, it is convenient when you need Friday night McFlurries, yes. But we are always looking around, are there other opportunities that we can use the network for? We have a strong capability of being able to help people access earnings opportunities and leads for work. And so we think a lot about how we can use that, as well as a large network of customers. And in the US and Europe, we have a freight business, which is that's an early stage business. We're looking at how we can use that technology in order to be able to help shippers connect with drivers in order to reduce inefficiency in that network. So, I mean, freight is a new business when we're understanding how our technology can be used to help improve the efficiency of drivers and connect them with shipping loads, and also help people fill up shipping loads so that it's more efficient.
So I've used Uber as a courier when I forgot a laptop.
Did you send a driver?
So I called an Uber, gave him the laptop, and shipped it to my wife.
Yeah.
I can't remember. Has she forgotten the laptop or not? Either way, I've used Uber. I invented Uber Courier.
Well, thank you very much. We're not going to pay you any royalties, but I think that's actually a use case that we hear about quite a lot. That people do that. We've experimented, and we will continue to experiment around understanding how the platform can be used. But we're pretty happy with how effective the launch of Uber Eats has been, and we're trying to balance around which of the pieces are experiment in and where, and kind of running the existing businesses.
I guess the question isn't so much when is it coming, just what do you think are the differences that make Uber Eats a much more readily available opportunity for Uber than any of the other logistics options? Because logistics is a very, very it's an enormous sector. It's talked about all the time. What are the more difficult, very highly fragmented, what are the more difficult things in that sector that have prevented it from coming online as early as Uber Eats?
I mean, one of the things that our core technology at the moment is around on demand. You hit a button and somebody will come and pick you up then. Not in 2 hours' time, not in an hour's time, then at that point. And same with Uber Eats. It's very on demand. It is, I want food and I need it in the next 20 minutes. And that's the Uber skill set that we bring. What we have less of at the moment is scheduled logistics, which is place an order and we will deliver it at 6 o'clock tonight or 4 o'clock this afternoon or in 3 hours time. That's not to say we wouldn't innovate into that space, but the core technology behind the rides business is on demand. Hit a button, get it now. That is extremely relevant for hot food, getting food delivered when you want it. It is less relevant and less commercially viable for something where you don't need it right then and there. If you're happy to get it same day delivery or next day delivery, then that is a different model.
And just to go down a rabbit hole, I've noticed that a lot of the advertising now I see at airports is the kind of live pickup time. So is that are people's expectations shifting as they're getting used to seeing a car approaching them on a map? What's driving that focus on time?
Yeah, they absolutely, expectations absolutely have changed. From when we launched, I think people were like excited to see 9 minutes. They were like, oh my God, this is incredible. And now I think if I see 9 minutes, I'm like, wow. I call my team. I'm like, what is going on? I want it in 3. But I think that is kind of core of what Uber brings to Australians, is the fact that our network is extremely reliable. There are times, peak times, morning commute can be slightly slower, but typically you can get a ride across Sydney in under 4 minutes. And I think that is hard to do, and something that we understand that people care about a lot.
Uber has internationally gone through some pretty well publicised cultural challenges. There was the earlier incarnation of Uber, I guess. It was the move fast and break things approach. And there's a lot of commentators that suggest it was really the only way to get Uber to where it was a few years ago. These days, Uber is a lot more collaborative with government, working to evolve regulations hand in hand with government, and ensuring that Uber kind of fits into the transport system, less of a combative approach. Do you think that has any consequence for how fast Uber can innovate and deliver these new services that Uber may have been at the forefront of before?
If I think back to kind of when Uber launched, I think even from the get-go, we always wanted to be regulated. It was a new product and a new service, and that did require regulators to think about things differently in a different way. But the intent and the conversation was always there, and it's been, there is an aspect of disruption comes with change, and change can be hard. And so I think that was needed, though we did learn lessons along the way around the right way to do that. If I think about where we are now, we know that the right way to operate, given that we are a $70 billion valued public company, there are ways of operating, which is working in close collaboration with our government and our partners and the communities in which we operate. So if I take something like Uber Elevate, for instance, where we are trying to innovate into a brand new space of...
Sorry, Uber Elevate?
Uber Elevate is aerial flying cars.
Uber Air, it seems to be called in the media.
We call it Uber Air. It's the team internally is Uber Elevate.
Oh, okay.
But if you take that, for instance, that is a new innovation. It is really forward thinking. But the only way we're successful to get that live is with very close collaboration with regulators, government agencies from the get-go. Mm-hmm. So actually, I'm not sure this does slow us down. I think this will enable us to launch things in the way that we know they need to be launched.
I guess the example that comes to mind is the shared e-scooters, which have, come out of nowhere. Absolutely, and suddenly
have you tried them?
I have.
What did you think?
I love them. I've actually not super legally bought one for my partner to use in Sydney. We're waiting for it to be legalised. Right? Yeah. We'll see. We might be able to cut that part out.
Yeah, he controls the editing.
And you guys have, I think, bought into that space with Jump in the US and maybe even a chunk of Lime, if I've read correctly. And maybe previously Uber would have been their first thing. Do you think is that an example of that, or is it just not one company can't do everything all the time?
We bought Jump a couple of years ago. We're very excited about the micro-mobility space, and we are an investor in Lime as well. And we recently actually launched Jump in Wellington. We won a tender there with the government in order to operate in that space. I think actually if we take the micromobility space, safety is one of our number one priorities across our entire platform, rides, eats, as well as micromobilities. And there's work to do in this space. We've been innovating and doing a lot of work on actually the Jump hardware, the actual scooters and the bikes in order to make sure that they are the safest that you can get. They are not the type that you bought for your wife. They are substantially more evolved and safer battery change, safer stability of where the battery sits on the vehicle to make sure that accidents are less likely to happen. So I think this is a conscious choice on our behalf that we want to make sure that the product that we put to market is the safest that it can be. We believe we are on that path. And so that's choice we're making about when and where to invest. But also just to make sure we're really clear about what the business model of this looks like and how it plays into the transport network. But it's exciting. I think scooters are, we're excited to bring them to more cities.
So another part of the cultural shift at Uber is a big focus on gender equality. I think the number 1 and 2 ranked staff in the Australia, New Zealand jurisdiction are women now as well. Coincidence or not? Can you talk us through how that change has manifested itself in the organisation?
Yeah. I joined Uber in November 2016, which was just a matter of weeks before there was a blog released in the US by a former employee in the tech team talking about some of her experiences. The change that caused in the business almost overnight in response to that was extraordinary to see. An entire top to bottom review of how Uber was operating. And I think that came from both the leadership and the employees saying, this is not a company that some people recognize, but also it wasn't what we wanted to be in. And
because that's actually quite a pervasive problem in Silicon Valley, isn't it? It's not just unique to Uber.
I mean, kind of gender inequality in senior leadership is absolutely not an Uber issue. That is an issue that I have since I started work. I don't think we've made progress as society. So this is definitely not an Uber issue. What I saw, though, was genuine commitment to change. And there has been a lot of change through 2017 from kind of new CEO joining, as well as everything from recruitment processes, performance management processes, promotions. All of these aspects have changed, and in a really fast amount of time. And so I think there is a reflection within the company that says we will look back on that episode in our history as one that was very difficult, but actually it meant that the company we have today is set up to be better than it potentially would have been had that not happened. And I don't believe that Uber is the only company in Silicon Valley or actually globally that would have similar type issues. I actually think the degree of change that Uber put itself through was quite extraordinary. And like you say, kind of when I read that blog and there was a lot of conversation internally within the Australian business, I did not recognise the things that were talked about. That is not me saying they didn't happen. I think that experience that was described is not something that anybody should have to live through. But when I think about the Australian culture, it's one of the most engaged and talented teams that I've ever had the privilege to work with. And like you say, kind of 5 out of our 8 leadership team members in Australia are female. So we actually have a gender diversity issue the other way. We're like, we need males in our shortlists for any senior roles.
I'm available.
You're not.
I mean, I'm not.
This is a podcast.
My work is bad. I mean, PwC is great. PwC is great.
Cut that.
On a different, a separate note on gender diversity, I'm intrigued by the Uber app is gender neutral, right? For drivers and users. It doesn't. I don't even know if you record people's gender on it. Are there interesting things that come up in the way different users from different backgrounds of any sort, gender or other, that use?
Do you mean the drivers or the passengers?
Well, drivers and users. I'm just interested by the different use cases, and particularly on the driver front. I think my experience has been there's more male drivers than female drivers. Do they engage with the app differently, different times, different use cases?
Different outcomes as well, as far as reviews or tips or whatever it is.
The majority of our driver partners on the platform are male at the moment, and we do see some differences around when people will drive, often actually around childcare. So one of the things that our driver partners talk to us about, actually both female and male, is that the ability to choose when that you drive allows them to be able to coordinate that with partners so that there is no need to pay for childcare. Now, actually, for some people, being in a job where you are rostered on and have to work certain shifts can mean that if you have to pay childcare, you could lose money by actually having to do that piece of work. Being able to earn using the Uber app at the time when you choose means that actually you get to bring home a lot more of that money in order for the household. So we kind of see those differences. I think we have a lot of focus on trying to make sure that the app is something that people can access in the way that they want to. And safety is a top concern for all of our driver partners. And so we're always working to try and make sure it is something that people can access in a way that they feel more comfortable. We tend to get fewer females driving very late at night for kind of because of safety concerns, which I think we can understand. It's not an Uber issue, that's a societal issue around female safety.
So if there is a different outcome as far as revenue earned, for example, it might be a reflection of the fact that sometimes women aren't able to drive at what might be the most lucrative time of day.
Yes, I think that would be accurate. We see fewer women driving at the peak hours, which would be a weekend night, late at night, than you do male.
And how is there? I mean, it might be impossible, but is there some way that Uber is thinking of to address that challenge?
We've been investing heavily in safety, and there's a number of features that we've launched over the last 12 months, and we're continuing to work in this space. So, for instance, last year we introduced rider quality ratings. We talked earlier about our rider ratings, but if you are a rider who is not treating driver partners with respect, then you will lose access to the Uber platform. If we get consistent feedback from driver partners that the rider is not behaving in the right way, then we will take them off the platform. This is for driver partners in order to be able to drive riders, and if they don't like those riders, then we're going to listen to that feedback.
Sure.
We also have a lot of other features, such as we introduced a safety toolkit, which has a emergency SOS button, which will go directly through to law enforcement. We introduced a feature called Track Your Ride, which both drivers and riders can use, so people can track live where somebody is using GPS.
Where my laptop's going.
Exactly. You can track your laptop, yeah. And, I use it with my kids sometimes with the hope that maybe they'll meet me at the door. Often they're just watching TV, but, we can dream. And so we continue working in the space, and also just using technology behind the scenes, so we can use data and in order to identify individuals who look like they're not behaving in a safe manner, in order to take decisions about whether we give them access.
There's a related development recently in Australia, an industrial relations development with the decision that came from the Fair Work Commission, where they determined that Uber driver partners are not traditional employees. Can you talk us through what that decision means to Uber and what it would have meant if it had gone the other way?
We talk to our driver partners frequently about what's important for them. And the number one reason people talk about using Uber is the flexibility, the ability to be able to choose when and where you earn. There's very few jobs that allow that. And in fact, there was a study done by a research company called Alpha Beta that looked into this and said, actually across Australia, the ability to access flexible work, which enables somebody to run their own business or study or as we talked about earlier, be able to navigate earning around childcare or any number of things that people have in their life, that ability to have flexible earnings opportunity is increasingly important in Australia. And actually, those opportunities there's not very many of them. And so we heard from driver partners, over 80% say that the flexibility to earn when and where is what's important to them. The vast majority of driver partners on the platform do it around another job or as a retiree or as a student. And so had that come out that they were required to be an employee, which would be associated with shifts and kind of confirmed times of working, the vast majority would not be able to earn in that way anymore.
So is our industrial relations system, are there changes that need to be made in order for you to operate as flexibly as you'd like? Because I've heard earlier that there may be some benefits that you want to give to drivers, maybe some training, maybe some kind of personal development, and the risk is that they might be might be classified as an employee after that. Are there changes that we need in our IR laws to accommodate the gig economy?
Our view is that flexibility in earning is an important aspect that people want, and that is why over 60,000 people choose every day to access the Uber app. Because remember, there's no obligation. If they do not have a good experience, then they can stop tomorrow. So I think actually Uber, more than anyone else, actually needs to make sure that every day we earn that trust and people choose to use the app. But we don't think that should come at the sacrifice of security. So we introduced last year a driver partner insurance, which means that if there is an incident while they're using the app, they are protected and there is insurance there. We would like to go further. For instance, in France, we have introduced maternity leave and paternity leave and also some kind of holiday pay for people using the Uber app through insurance products. We can't introduce that in Australia because of the IR laws today. So we are open to the conversation that a number of state governments and federal governments is exploring around what a third way would look like.
Right.
I want to ask a question about the broader transport networks. There's been some studies in overseas locations around the contribution that Uber makes to congestion, the evidence appears to be in some of those studies that Uber's circulating for jobs actually add to congestion. What are your thoughts on that? And is Uber making congestion worse or better?
In Australia, still 80% of trips are made by private cars. And that is the main cause of congestion, is people getting in their own car every day, driving into cities and parking and using precious real estate for car parks. So, we have introduced a number of products such as Uber Pool, which is our shared rides product, where you can get in a car. If you're going in a similar direction to other people, you can share that together. We think this technology, while still new, is a really great way for us to tackle congestion, but also thinking about how a product such as Uber can help connect people into the public transport network. So we don't believe that Uber on its own is a solution to congestion. However, if there's a way for us to connect people who I believe the vast majority, again, of people in Sydney and Melbourne don't live within 400 metres of a transport hub. If we can find a way to connect people to last mile of public transport, use public transport in a way that is affordable and convenient through the day, then we believe they'll leave their cars at home. And in that way, we can end up with less congestion.
So is that the key variable then? Because let's taking Sydney as an example. If you're out in a poorly serviced area, a public transport serviced area, then Uber is helping taking cars off the road. But maybe here in the CBD, it might be taking people out of public transport. Is that a risk that of the impact of Uber on a city?
I mean, I think we see ourselves as a transportation platform. And so, for instance, with the introduction of scooters and bikes, which we are working on across cities, the idea is that short trips would be done by an e-scooter and e-bike. And maybe over time, governments will start pedestrianising city centres such that you don't need cars. And then if you think about the choices people make about their transport, if there is a great public transport network that you can access using a product such as Uber without needing a private car, that's when people will start making those choices about not having the second car or thinking about whether they need the car if they're living in the city centre areas.
Can we dig into that a little bit? Because that's there is a broader question with all of Uber's, entrance with Jump and I think any other kind of transport option that Uber is going to be offering. Is Uber mode agnostic? Is Uber going to be just, a substitutable word for transport rather than Uber is particularly a rideshare app?
We are looking to build out the transportation suite of options. For instance, in Denver, we have a transit option where when you open the Uber app, you can see when the latest train is going to go or buses, or kind of connecting in and showing the information about public transport, as well as being able to access then other modes of transport. From our perspective, we want people to come to the Uber app first, see what the options are, and then be able to make a choice that ideally helps people move around in a more effective way.
So is that coming? Are we going to be able to open up the Uber app in anywhere in Australia? And the fastest way to get a trip might be Uber, then a train. Will Uber tell us that soon?
I hope so. We're working on it. We've got a trial live with the New South Wales government up in Manly, which is a partnership with the ferries in order to try and get more people onto the ferry, in order to kind of again get the cars off the bridge. And we've been using our pool product to try and encourage more people to use that, which has been pretty successful. So we're experimenting with governments. We're trying various things in order to see what works and what resonates with customers. But we're quite excited about what the future of that could mean.
So on the congestion piece, one thing we know is that as things get cheaper, people tend to consume them more. And we know the future of mobility is probably electric. It might well be autonomous, and all of those things will lead ultimately to a lower price of delivery, which will increase the use, and there's a finite amount of road supply and therefore more congestion. And Uber will be a contributor to that by bringing down the price. So do you have a view on things like more rationally pricing the road network so that the way it's consumed is more efficient?
Yeah, our view is that we're supportive of road pricing in order to reflect the true costs of that. If you fast forward to 10, 15 years from now, at a point where autonomous technology is advanced enough that is something pretty common, electric and battery technology is such that hopefully that is the vast majority of vehicles, it is not going to be good for our cities and our congestion if everybody owns their own individual electric autonomous car. We'll be in the same situation, it's just we'll be reading rather than steering when we're on the road. What we really hope the future will be is that the appropriate costs are reflected, that encourages people by using technology such as Uber that can connect people with vehicles, with bikes, with all different modes of transportation, that people begin shifting the mindset of transport being something you own to transport being something that you consume on a per-use basis. That would be the ideal, because then that will begin to more accurately reflect
how proactive is Uber in that in Australia? Because it's just recently, I guess, in New York, the congestion charge was announced there, and Uber was actually at the forefront of campaigning for it. Are you as active here? Can you see as clear a path to something like that in Australia, or is it a fair while away?
We spend quite a lot of time talking to transport ministers in all of the states across Australia, across a variety of things. The across kind of existing rideshare regulations, new modalities such as e-scoots, e-bikes, and just what their future thoughts are. So we contribute our input to transport ministers and give them our thoughts, and we hope to work with them as they begin planning out what it looks like for each of the states.
You're effectively already paying a distance-based charge, I'm guessing, for your insurance and for every other part of the cost of the fleet. It wouldn't really be that much of a leap for a company like Uber to also calculate a road user charge. What do you think then? What is the path to some kind of rational road pricing mechanism here? What do you think is the first step? Because electric vehicles are often touted as, the fuel excise is going to disappear, and maybe that's going to be the burning platform. What do you think is the path to getting that pricing mechanism here?
The follow-up question for me is, so I think that electric
and we have a
vehicles,
different opinion on this, by the way.
So I think electric vehicles are the opportunity. If we get in at the thin end of the wedge and apply a road user charge to electric vehicles, we'll be solving a long-term problem. But if we don't do it with electric vehicles, it strikes me that mobility platforms are another opportunity, because it's you can apply it with a changing technology with a new thing. And Ilya mentioned about having, you have all of the mechanics of it already there. You're an entity through which
and the benefits are so discrete. You can directly benefit in a way that maybe other individual users might not, whereas Uber will directly benefit by a less congested jurisdiction.
I think it's important that you have alternatives in place before you move down the path. And so at the point at which there are a legitimate set of transport alternatives from things like rideshare, but as well as the public transport networks, maybe it's on-demand public transport, on-demand small buses operating a route, as well as mobility scooters, e-scooters and e-bikes. If you have those alternatives, then I think you are more able to introduce things such as a road tax. Because I think we know that there's a number of households that, if you were to introduce that and they do not have a cost-effective alternative means of transportation, that has a big impact on people's household budgets. Transportation remains one of the biggest costs that people have to deal with. So I think it's important that transport ministers and the government is looking at it in a way of providing the alternatives. They have to be cost affordable. They have to be a legitimate alternative so that people are still able to get to work and actually people don't get priced out of working in city centres would be very important.
It's an interesting segue because you are actively participating in some of the trials for on-demand public transit, not ride sharing. Can you talk us through what the experience has been in this jurisdiction and also compared to others? Because I think companies like Via and Uber, I guess, in other jurisdictions are a fair few steps ahead of where we are in Australia on that particular mode.
We're talking to a number of governments and bus companies around what this looks like. And there's a few different options. We're finding that when we look internationally, there's a number of trials that Uber is doing around minibuses and actually having these on demand that do run sort of a schedule, but with a way for you to kind of indicate that you want to be picked up en route, and the buses will go around and collect that. And we're offering a safer solution, and they have alternatives as well as a very cost-effective way in some of the countries across the Middle East, Africa, and into some Eastern European countries. I think locally what we're trying to understand is how do you use the technology such as Pool, where actually being able to match people, being able to kind of have algorithms that can, in almost real time, say, we're going to have people going in similar directions. How do you get them in the same vehicle is quite difficult. We have millions of miles worth of trips that have enabled us to be able to build technology around that. But I think that provides really interesting alternatives and cost-effective alternatives in particularly some of the less dense areas. So if you think about bus routes and kind of traditional bus routes being used where there is traditional paths of traffic and then being substituted with on-demand, maybe using the existing Uber network of driver partners and their existing sedans, as well as kind of then thinking about high-capacity vehicles where demand lends itself, I think that is a more cost-effective way of operating for governments. Should
governments be contracting you and other companies for this, or is this something that Uber should be leading in the way that rideshare is completely independent of government, regulated but not contracted? Does the larger sort of those minibuses that you're describing, do you need a contract for it to work, or will you be going down that path on your own?
I think where it is commercially viable on a standalone basis, then that is something that Uber will innovate into and try. But I think for some of the challenges that exist within Australian cities, for instance, is in less dense areas where actually without a government subsidy, it is unlikely to be commercially viable. However, we believe the degree of subsidy would be less using an existing network than it would be in governments trying to create that on their own. So we do think there is a partnership opportunity here, and we're talking to a lot of governments about trying to understand what it is and how that could work.
In a related question, so in the east coast of Australia right now, there's a once-in-a-generation investment in infrastructure, particularly mass transit infrastructure. Do you think enough focus on the impact of ride sharing is being put into the way that infrastructure's planned? You know, we think about a future where there's an Uber taking you to a train station. Is there enough space for people to drop off and be picked up? Because this is 100-year infrastructure that's being put in. Is it taking account of the future you're describing?
I mean, I think there's still a lot of car parks being built around infrastructure. And so if you think about kind of the amount of real estate that goes into car parks at train stations, it's a lot. And I think that still is the bias that is there. And
it'd be great spots for an Uber Air launch pad.
Right, or even just more affordable housing. You know, this is... land, particularly in the busy cities, is at a premium. And when it's being used purely to put cars in for hours of a day, you wonder if it could be used to better purposes. And we're actually seeing, you know, some governments around the world are actually requiring that new car parks have different specifications such that they can more easily be converted into accommodation. So higher roof, for instance, so that there is less conversion cost if and when that time comes. But there's some technology, for instance, if we think about airports, that we have good technology where we can match airport drop-offs with pickups, but requiring them to be on the same level, on the same route is important. If they are at different heights, then that technology becomes redundant. And so we're working with our airport partners and with the new airport in Western Sydney, for instance, so that we can provide input around what technology exists that should be considered as these infrastructures get built, so that they are built for the long term. So
are they listening? Are you feeding into these longer term infrastructure projects now?
Yeah, we have really positive relationships with the major infrastructure, airports in particular, and with all of the transport ministers and infrastructure across Australia. We're helping to provide just the view of what transportation and technology might be, and we still don't know exactly what it will look like, but autonomous is probably it's a technology that will work, and maybe it's a 10-year horizon, but that means that it's worth thinking about how do you create routes where autonomous vehicles can move, and thinking about how they work alongside people driving cars is interesting for people to consider. But also then, how do you think about within city centres things like e-scooters and e-bikes? And a lot of the safety implications to do with those are to do with the fact there are cars and pedestrians and those vehicles in existing space. But perhaps if we were planning from scratch, you would build something a bit different so that you could make better use of those.
Was that an announcement date for when we're going to have autonomous vehicles here? Was 10 years from now is the planned launch date?
It is. We are working on it. The technology is advanced, but there's still work to do. But I think it's that kind of time frame.
It is gets a lot of attention, probably more attention than it deserves, given all the other work that Uber does. But the autonomous vehicle project, I think it's in Phoenix that Uber's doing most of its autonomous vehicle work, gets a lot of attention. And it, as you said, it will be launched eventually. Does that mean that we need to, in that time frame, maybe invest less in public transit, or is it something that's going to fit into these major public transit investments?
We think public transport still is going to remain one of the most cost-effective and environmentally friendly ways of moving people around en masse. Again, as I talked about, what we want to avoid is everybody having their own autonomous vehicle that they use independently in order to travel around. That will cause our cities to just standstill. And so the intent is absolutely not to take people off public transport networks and to ensure that cities still have that core of transport networks, but then to think about them as a hub and spoke model. How do you connect people to their nearest public transport node in a way that is cost effective so that they choose to use that rather than drive their own car? And then obviously the public transport that they get, the frequency of that, the reliability needs to be there in order for them to be something that they can choose to do from early morning until late at night.
I'm you sort of conscious of time, being very generous with your time today. We have one last question for you, which is what's your favourite type of infrastructure and why? I would have to say extremely tall buildings, and that is because I have a 9-year-old son who talks to me about extremely tall buildings on a regular basis. So his favourite thing is he loves the Burj Khalifa. When I was in Taiwan recently, he made me go to the Taipei 101, and I think there's something fascinatingly ambitious about the fact we as humans create these extraordinarily beautiful, very tall creations just because we can. That is the first vertical infrastructure answer we've had to that question. Everybody else has gone linear.
Yeah, that's courtesy of Noah Anderson. So
it's probably a segue for an Uber Air
indeed.
launch.
Susan, thank you very much for your time. It's been a great discussion.
It's been great.
Thanks, Susan.
Cheers.
So that was our chat with Susan Anderson of Uber. Ilya, any thoughts?
Yeah, look, obviously it was a fun discussion for all of us, but what I'm most encouraged by is that Susan seems to represent a genuinely tech and innovation-driven approach to transport infrastructure in a way that I don't know if any other companies have been able to add so successfully, whether that's because they have legacy businesses to protect or otherwise. With Uber, I feel like it genuinely changes the way we engage with transport in a way that few other transport or tech businesses have successfully managed to achieve.
I was really struck by their willingness to try new things. It's certainly notable, and I suspect that will increasingly make them a key part of the transport industry overall. So that's it for today. Thank you to Susan Anderson for coming in and being so generous with her time, Ilya for hosting with me, and PwC Australia for hosting us here at their offices in Barangaroo. As always, we strongly encourage you to subscribe on your Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts or Spotify platforms, or indeed wherever you get your podcasts. Once you subscribe, you'll be notified about new episodes as they're published. We also really appreciate any feedback you may have. You can send that to us directly, you can send it via LinkedIn, or maybe add a review on Apple Podcasts. Inside Infrastructure is an Infrastructure Partnerships Australia podcast, sponsored by PwC Australia. This episode was produced by Adam Stevens from TAG, PwC's media agency. Research was conducted by Michael Player, Mitch Dudley and Linda Bergerson. Past episodes can be found on the Inside Infrastructure page at both Infrastructure Partnerships Australia and PwC, as well as on SoundCloud. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from.